Hi there, everyone. I think that we are live. Oh my gosh, and there's so many comments already. This is exciting. I'm Kylie Reed. I'm the author of Such a Fun Age, and I am so excited to be here with Barnes & Noble, and especially with Brit Bennett, the author of The Vanishing Half, which is the June Barnes & Noble Book Club selection. Brit, thanks so much for chatting with me today.
Thanks for being here.
Yeah. So we have a lot of good things coming up, including a little reading from Brit. We're going to dive into some of the book club questions, and Barnes & Noble readers have been exploring those questions, and I feel like we get to ask the teacher like all of those questions and get all of those answers. And we're also going to be taking some questions from viewers as well. But first, I want to do this properly and introduce Brit in the way she deserves. So Brit is born and raised in Southern California. She graduated from Stanford University and later earned her MFA in fiction at the University of Michigan, where she won a Hopwood Award in graduate short fiction, as well as the 2014 Hurston Wright Award for college writers. She is a National Book Foundation 5 Under 35 awardee, and her debut novel, The Mothers, was a New York Times bestseller, and I think it's like on my shelf, like right there. Her second novel, The Vanishing Half, which I have right here, was an instant #1 New York Times bestseller. Her essays are featured in The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, and the Paris Review, and Jezebel. So welcome, Brit. And before I ask you a lot of questions, I would love for you to set the scene and read for us a little bit. And while Brit is reading, everyone who's doing comments on the side, if you want to ask some questions for Brit, she can answer those later. So here we go. Brit, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Kylie, for being here, for doing this with me. Thank you, Barnes & Noble, for picking The Vanishing Half, and thank you, everybody, for watching. So yeah, I'm just going to read a little tiny short section from the beginning of the book, and this is a section that introduces you to the town where the novel opens and that the novel is kind of about. So this is just from the first chapter of The Vanishing Half. It was a strange town. Mallard, named after the ring-necked ducks living in the rice fields and marshes. A town that, like any other, was more idea than place. The idea arrived to Alphonse Dessor in 1848 as he stood in the sugarcane fields he'd inherited from the father who'd once owned him. The father, now dead, the now freed son, wished to build something on those acres of land that would last for centuries to come. A town for men like him, who would never be accepted as white, but refused to be treated like Negroes. A third place. His mother, rest her soul, had hated his lightness. When he was a boy, she'd shoved him under the sun, begging him to darken. Maybe that's what made him first dream of the town. Lightness, like anything inherited at great cost, was a lonely gift. He'd married a mulatto even lighter than himself. She was pregnant then with their first child, and he imagined his children's children's children, lighter still, like a cup of coffee steadily diluted with cream, a more perfect Negro. Each generation lighter than the one before. Soon others came. Soon idea and place became inseparable, and Mallard carried throughout the rest of St. Landry Parish. Colored people whispered about it, wondered about it. White people couldn't believe it even existed. When St. Catherine's was built in 1938, the diocese sent over a young priest from Dublin who arrived certain that he was lost. Didn't the bishop tell him that Mallard was a colored town? Well, who were these people walking about? Fair and blonde and red-headed, the darkest ones no swarthier than a Greek. Was this who counted for colored in America, who whites wanted to keep separate? Well, how could they ever tell the difference? By the time the Veen twins were born, Alphonse Dessor was dead, long gone. But his great-great-great-granddaughters inherited his legacy, whether they wanted to or not. Even Desiree, who complained before every Founder's Day picnic, who rolled her eyes when the founder was mentioned in school, as if none of that business had anything to do with her. This would stick after the twins disappeared. How Desiree never wanted to be part of the town that was her birthright. How she felt that you could flick away history like shrugging a hand off your shoulder. You can escape a town, but you cannot escape blood. Somehow the Veen twins believed themselves capable of both. And yet, if Alphonse Dessor could have strolled through the town he'd once imagined, he would have been thrilled by the sight of his great-great-great-granddaughters. Twin girls, creamy skin, hazel eyes, wavy hair. He would have marveled at them. For the child to be a little more perfect than the parents, what could be more wonderful than that? think I'll stop there.
That's a great line to end on. That was really wonderful. And I feel like just hearing it back, I always have this, question behind my mind, like, are people are going to ask questions? But I feel like just from you reading, like the comments were popping off. Like people are very excited to talk about this book for very obvious reasons. That was really wonderful. And if you're good, I'm going to dive into some of these questions. Let's do it. So let's start somewhere I love starting, which is your title. I feel that The Vanishing Half accomplishes so much and applies to so many of the characters. And something I recently heard a reader comment on is how it's not just the twins and it's a very, that's your other half. But at some point, Reese loses a part of himself. At some point, Adele loses a part of her memory. And I was wondering what you were most focused on with accomplishing with this title.
Yeah, well, I have to say it was not my idea. I cannot take credit for it. I'm just bad at titling things. If I don't know it immediately, I'm just never going to get there. So it was a community effort that was really the credit of my agent Julia and my editor Sarah. We all had to kind of put our heads together to try to think of titles for the book. And when I think Julia suggested it, I liked it for some of those reasons that you just explained. I thought it spoke to a lot of the different characters. The twins, obviously, as you said, losing half of yourself when you lose your sister. There's also this idea of Stella kind of losing this half of herself as she's becoming this different person and assuming this new identity. These other characters like Reese who have experienced some type of change in a way. And I think I also just like the fact that the title, it felt visual, it felt, when we eventually arrived with the book cover and everything, there was something really disturbing about that image to me. I think it's a pretty image, but it's also unsettling, I think, with the title, because you have these faces and you can't really tell if they're kind of merging together or if one is consuming the other. And there's a tension in that. So I think it works well with that title because I think there is something unsettling about the phrase, the vanishing half. You're kind of like, well, what's disappearing, So I liked that it worked in all those ways. I'm glad we landed there.
I do too. And I feel that there's something with the vanishing half in many of these situations that it isn't just, it's gone. I like how certain people are really visible to certain people the whole time. Like there's a moment when Stella returns and her mom's like, oh, hey, how are you? And just like nothing has happened. And it reminds me of, when you come home from college or something and your parents are like, I know who you are a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah,
I'm exactly keep going. Yeah. I don't know if you had that, just trying to be cool and trying to be a different person, but that other half still is with you. So also, does that mean that you usually write without a title when you're crafting something?
Yeah, I mean, this title, like the document, I just had it called like Mallard and then whatever iteration of the draft. So usually have some type of a working something, but I don't even remember what the mothers, whatever my document, I went through so many different iterations because that was also a title that we arrived at very late into the process. So I usually have some kind of thing so I know what I'm working on, but it was weird with The Vanishing Half because there were all these sections in the book that have titles, and I was fine coming up with section titles. So I was like, okay, you can come up with 5 or 6 titles, but you cannot come up with one for the book. That was where I was stumped. So I was grateful that we had a sort of hive mind to try to arrive there.
That's amazing. I love hearing what writers' draft titles are because, for the most brilliant writers, it wouldn't surprise me if your title was twins or something, and that would be it. It's always a mess.
Exactly.
So let's go to some characters. Many of the characters here are engaged in a kind of performance of some kind from a very traditional setting. Like Kennedy is an actress who later, gets confused to be a soap opera star. Barry is also a performer. Reese takes on a new role that isn't a costume. And you could probably argue that Stella's whole marriage and lifestyle is kind of a performance. So I'm curious what went into shaping these varying depictions of performance and transformation.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the questions I had thinking about this book was, particularly in the case of somebody like Stella, was what does it mean when the performance begins to feel real? And I'm always fascinated when you hear actors talk about that, this, you know, not even necessarily like method acting, but just actors who will be like, you know, in that moment, I felt like I was whatever character. So I'm always really fascinated by that experience. And I wanted to think about that for Stella, of how she goes from, at the very beginning, very consciously performing this other person that she kind of names as somebody sort of separate from herself. How she goes from that consciousness towards where you see her kind of towards the end, where it has become so second nature to her that she's not even really thinking about it twice. So I liked that kind of question about performance. But then I was also interested in these performances that are very temporary. So you mentioned Barry, Barry is somebody who embraces this performance of gender as a drag queen, but in a way that's playful and creative and temporary. And in the same way that Kennedy kind of feels more like herself when she is on the stage performing as some other character. So I wanted to think of these performances that are very long lasting and feel kind of permanent, like Stella. But I also wanted to think about these performances that are shorter terms and also still meaningful, but something that can be, more temporary, and kind of the sort of, I guess, the tension between those types of performances at play.
Right. There's so many, it's when you look at it, there's so many different types of performances that way. And I'm curious, if quarantine was not a thing, you have unlimited budget to spend on a performance that you would enjoy, where would you go?
Ooh, I really do miss live. That's so hard. I really do miss live music. I think I would love to see a concert or something. The idea of going to a concert right now or ever really is kind of unthinkable. But I saw, I think the last concert I went to was Brittany Howard from the Alabama Shakes, and she's incredible. And I'm so happy I got to see her last fall. But yeah, I think I would want to go see a concert and hear some live music.
Yeah. That makes total sense at this time right now. Let's talk about some of the romantic relationships in the novel, which is one of my favorite things, especially between Desiree and Early. That was probably my favorite, but there's also Stella and Blake, and then there's also Reese and Jude. And I would love to hear you talk about how crafting these characters is very different, especially depending on the relationship between the couples and the past or the truth. And this sounds so silly, but I mean, even with Early and Desiree, they are probably like the most in love. And one of my favorite moments was when Desiree did not allow Jude to sleep in the same room. And she's like, you guys aren't married either, but that's totally fine. Like, keep your rules however you want to go. But even with the most successful relationships, it doesn't mean that they're always honest about the past. And so I would love to hear about crafting these three relationships.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what I enjoy the most about writing. I just enjoy writing relationships and these sort of moments of tenderness and moments of love, moments of cruelty, the ways in which all of these things kind of pop up. I guess to look at them kind of one at a time, I think Desiree and Early, that was a couple that I really loved writing. There were iterations of the book that took a sort of darker turn with their relationship. Like, their relationship wasn't, I think, as sort of, I don't know if wholesome is the word, but like, it ends up being, I think, a nice relationship to read about. And at first there was, I think, more tension between them. But I loved the idea of them being in this kind of unconventional sort of marriage. They're not legally married, but they've been together all these years, and they don't even live in the same house all of the time because Early's coming and going, but that still does not make their relationship any less valid or any less meaningful. And at the same time, it is, sort of controversial that they're doing this in this very like deeply Catholic town and in the time period. So I love the idea of this as this kind of, Desiree coming from this relationship, from this marriage that is abusive and controlling and restricting, and then entering this relationship that allows her some space to breathe and to feel like she can be free alongside this other person. So I really loved that. And, I don't know, I love a sort of relationship between people who meet when they're like, teenagers and following what does it look like? I love it. And then being like, what does it look like when they're in their 40s? And if, what does it look like for those two people? So I loved that. And I also loved the idea of Desiree just like trying to pressure her daughter into this conventional marriage that she herself doesn't want, because that just felt so like pitch perfect to me of often mother-daughter relationships. So I've had fun writing that kind of dynamic between them. And I think Reese and Jude, I think that was probably my favorite couple to write in the book. I'm always, whenever I'm writing relationships, I'm thinking, you know, what do these two people want from each other? And I think for that relationship, you know, you have these two people who have both experienced these very painful pasts. They've both experienced a lot of violence and shame surrounding their bodies. So what does it take for them to learn how to love each other and learn how to love themselves? So to me, that was something that I enjoyed writing, that relationship of, you know, they begin as friends and it's kind of ambiguous and confusing. And you see how it sort of unfolds. So I love that. I love an ambiguous friendship also. So I enjoyed writing that. And I think Stella and Blake, I don't often get asked about that marriage. I think that it's obviously,
a marriage.
It's a marriage. I also just like enjoy, you know, they have the most sort of conventional relationship maybe in the book, where they are sort of traditionally married and they've got the child in the house in the suburbs and all these things. And yet at the same time, you know, their relationship is actually quite unconventional, because there are giant swaths of Stella's life that Blake has no access to.
Yeah.
So for that relationship, I wanted to think about, again, what do they see in each other? What does Stella see in Blake? Because it wasn't enough for me to be like, oh, Blake is, you know, he has money or he's got influence or power. That wasn't interesting to me, to think of Stella seeing only that in him. So I wanted to think about the way that, like, I did enjoy writing the kind of, I don't know, the sort of early, I don't even want to call it like I don't know, that the early when Stella meets Blake and she's working for him.
I love those pages.
Well, I know. Yeah. I enjoyed writing them, but also like I also wanted to think about Stella sort of continually reevaluating that sort of very stereotypical kind of boss secretary dynamic that I think now in our, you know, 21st century standpoint we recognize as a problematic. And I think Stella starts to kind of think about that too, but at the same time thinking about what would it have meant for her at that time to be treated like this by this person. And to me, that's more important than thinking about, I don't know, how maybe I would look at it or how I would look at it now, but thinking about like, what was that feeling for her to be taken out to this nice restaurant by this man? And it would have meant so much to her, you know? So I enjoyed writing the early Stella and Blake and thinking about kind of what she sees in him as this sort of Prince Charming that kind of rescues her from, you know, whatever she thought her life was going to look like. But also, again, as you know, see that relationship become a little bit more complicated as they both kind of grow and change. That was something I also enjoyed writing.
Right. I was wondering if, you know, thinking of their relationship between secretary and boss, that like Stella, maybe not knowing it, loves that their relationship started out professional, and then keeping that distance their entire marriage is like something that she doesn't even realize that she's looking for. I don't know if you thought about that as well.
Right. You know, I didn't think about it like that, but I think that's a really good reading of it. You know, like Stella is somebody who prides herself on her intellect and her skill and being able to sort of, you know, accomplish things. So again, for like that to be the way that Blake, she meets Blake, and that to be like what pulls Blake into her, it pulls them, each of them, into each other's orbit. I do think that that's something that would appeal to her in that way.
Yeah. Yeah. The things that we find attractive secretly are scary. So poor stuff. And then we're going to get into what was my favorite chapter, which was the one with Loretta and Stella. I think a great way to understand who someone has become in the time that you haven't seen them is really watching how they interact with people. Like, I understand so much more just watching them in a scene with someone rather than someone just like telling me exactly who they are now. And so I love the chapter because it, you know, her relationship with this neighbor, you know, that feeling of like, oh my gosh, wait, am I going to make a friend here? Oh, wait, do you want to hang out? This is fine. It almost feels like exciting, like a crush, but also there's so much going on because this is a Black woman coming into Stella's white neighborhood and she has a lot of feelings around that. And so I'm curious for you, what specifically is Loretta representing for Stella? And what does Loretta bring out about Stella's commitment to her own identity through just being across the street from her?
Yeah. I mean, I think describing it as a crush is accurate. Like that's kind of the way I thought about it. I think, I don't know if you feel this way, but I think it can often be hard to write about friendship because you don't have the same like shorthands of writing about romance, right? Like when I think about, you think about sort of milestones of romance and maybe you're like, oh, this is the first time we kissed, or this is the first time we held hands or went on a date. When I think about like my closest friends, I don't remember the moment that we became friends or like the moment that I knew.
That's such a good point.
Like I don't know what those things are. And often for me when I'm writing, I think about people confiding in each other, like those being kind of linchpin moments. But I don't often think about that for my own relationship. I just like, oh, we were always friends, which obviously is not true. But that's kind of how I remember it. So for me, I sometimes I have to think about sort of that kind of emotion of that lack of certainty, that kind of insecurity, the feeling of not wanting to be, not wanting to be seen in some way that you don't want to be seen by somebody. All of those kind of nervous, fluttery feelings of a crush. I try to think about those when I'm trying to develop a friendship.
Yeah.
And I think particularly for Stella, it definitely is because there's something secret about it. There's something forbidden about it. It has that kind of feeling of an illicit affair. So, I wanted to think about ways in which I could push Stella. So the idea of this Black family moving into her white neighborhood, and not only that, but moving directly across the street from her within like this cul-de-sac. So they're like enclosed.
It's like a little mirror.
Exactly.
Yeah, right in front of her. I love that.
Exactly. So like that idea was like, okay, that will be great. That's going to push her. So I wanted to think about that. And I think as far as your question of kind of, what's at the heart of that friendship, I think for me, there's a way in which Loretta becomes this very big threat for Stella. It's not that so much that Stella is like, I hate Black people. I don't want a Black person to move in here. She's really afraid that Loretta is going to discover her. She's afraid that Loretta is going to be able to tell that, she's hiding something in the way that her white neighbors can't tell. So she's acting kind of this fear response. So I wanted to think about that. So she's got this kind of fear happening. But also there's this allure to Loretta. There's this sense of, there's kind of a sense of glamour to her. There's a way in which Stella sees her life as aspirational, in a way that the rest of the neighborhood kind of looks like, they're sort of looking down on her, but I think in a way that they also resent and envy her. Right. So Stella sees her life as aspirational, but I think also there's a way in which, of course, Loretta reminds her of her sister. She is funny like Desiree. She's got some of the boldness and some of that kind of personality that Desiree has. So to me, it was thinking about that section. It was thinking about what is it that draws Stella to Loretta and what is also that scares her about this relationship, and having her kind of exist in that tension and being pulled one way and pulled another way and kind of bouncing between those poles.
Yeah. There's so much going on there. And even just hearing you talk about it now, I think, oh my gosh, Stella must have had these feelings of like, oh, well, she gets to live in this neighborhood and not lie about who she is. Like, could I have done that? And like, oh, I'm the problem with doing this in this relationship. And I see some of the people in the comments, which I love. People are like, Loretta knew. She knew. I know she knew. Which, maybe she did. But I'd love to hear what you think about this, because on one end, I'm like, maybe she did. But at the same time, I feel like a Black woman would kind of hold her cards to her chest, whether she knew or not.
I mean,
so what do you think?
Yeah. So I've been asked that quite a few times. And I will say there were like versions of the book where I answered that question more explicitly, or like, so there are versions where like Loretta confronts Stella, and there are versions where I sort of more explicitly address that question. I chose not to do it ultimately, like not to give a definitive answer, just because I did like leaving. I liked that feeling of, because I think that recreates sort of the paranoia of what it means to be Stella, which is that she's constantly wondering, do they know? So I love the idea of creating that for the reader. I'm sorry to say to anybody who wanted a definitive answer. But I think, I do think that Loretta knows. And I love the idea of what you said, Kylie, of her like kind of keeping it close to her. I think it's I think about like the book Passing by Nella Larson. And I think like one of the interesting tensions in that book is sort of, are you loyal to your community or are you loyal to this individual person? And if I am loyal to this person who has passed out of the community, is that me being loyal to the community, or is this me, so there's that kind of question of, if this person has, sort of cast away the community by me keeping her secret, is that actually me being loyal to the community, or is that me being disloyal to the community? And I think it's such an interesting question. I don't have an answer for it, but I do love the idea of sort of readers having to kind of sit in that uncertainty. So I'm sorry everybody, but I do enjoy it.
No, I love it. I'm here for it. Also, I love that what you're saying from her book too about the community, because like she's wrestling with this thing and being like, is this like, bad for my community? Oh wait, who's my community? All these white people here. Like, what does this even mean in terms of where I live? So I love that you kept that a lot. And then I'm going to do one more question before we dive into reader questions. Actually, maybe a few more. I would love to know about your process of writing Kennedy and Jude's relationship. So we have Kennedy, who's born into wealth, and a mother who's very distant from her. And Jude's mother is low income and grows to have a really special and sweet relationship with the man who treats her and Jude really kindly. And so I was wondering if you could talk about their dynamic, because even though it's very distant and doesn't start until way later, and they're cousins, there is like a sister quality to the way that they relate to each other in a way. So I would love to know more about that.
Yeah, I found that the most difficult relationship to write in the book because of some of the reasons that you just pointed out. They grow up in such totally different worlds. They don't meet each other until they're, in their 20s. So they're kind of who they are by the time they actually encounter each other. I also knew that there was a lot of pressure on that meeting. And I think when you read a book like this where characters are apart, you're waiting for the moment where the stories converge. So I knew that there would be pressure on them meeting like that.
Right.
But I did think about their relationship as sort of antagonistic, but they're not enemies. There's a way in which they know how to get under each other's skin, which I think is very intimate. Yes. I think that's actually a sign of intimacy, to be able to do that with somebody and know exactly what's going to get on their nerves. And there is something sisterly about that. I have two older sisters. I'm the youngest, so I know very well how to annoy my sisters, So I love the idea of that being the dynamic. I never imagined that, these women, they're going to meet and they're going to be best friends. Like, I didn't think that would felt right, because they are so different from each other. They have, these really different life experiences and these often unkind perceptions of each other. I think they both kind of make a lot of snap judgments about each other that are pretty brutal. But I loved that idea of like knowing exactly how to hurt somebody, and that being something that actually shows how intimate your relationship is. So as I kept working on it, I kept thinking about like, what does that look like for these two? Yeah. And I loved kind of imagining what do they look like down the road? What does their relationship look like as they continue to get older and become the people?
Yeah, that is so true. When you're a sister, when you're a family member, you just know exactly how to take that and it's just like,
exactly.
So we're going to get into some reader questions in a second. However, I may have made a list of some sisters that I want to ask you about. Okay, so the question is, you are quarantining for 2 weeks. Which sister do you do it with? And it's not like who do you like more. It's like which one's going to be best for you for 2 weeks, just you two.
Okay.
Start with classic, Tia and Tamara.
So are we talking their characters on the show or the actual people?
The characters on the show.
The characters on the show.
So Tia, right. So Tia was like the intellectual one, and her mom was Jack A, right? And then Tamara was like the really boy crazy one with Tim Reed as her dad. So who do you live with for 2 weeks?
Oh, so do the parents are they also included in this?
Oh, that's a great question. Sure, because Jack A is great. Sure.
Yeah. Okay. If that's the case, then I have to go with Tia because I think I would have a blast with Jack A. And I think, I think Tia would, I think quarantine, like I'm an introverted person. I think being with somebody who's very extroverted would probably be quite draining. So I think Tia and I could sit in like companionable silence and just like read our books side by side, and we'd have a great 2 weeks.
Yes, I agree. I see a Tia all the way in the comments. You're not allowed. Okay, this one's a little bit harder. Quarantine is happening. Who do you stay with, Solange or Beyonce?
Ooh.
I hate to get political here.
That is truly a political question. Oh man, as soon as you asked it, my gut just said Solange. I feel like we, obviously love Beyonce. I love both of them. I think Solange and I would have some really interesting conversations. We're both Cancers, so I feel like we would vibe. I think Solange, we'd have a great 2 weeks chatting.
There you go. I really like that. That means your birthday's coming up. When's your birthday?
Well, no, it actually just passed. It was June 22nd.
There you go. Okay. And the last one is, let's see. Oh, Venus or Serena? Who's it going to be for you?
Ooh.
I know.
That's tough.
I know.
I think Venus and I would probably get along better, but I do think Serena would be fun. Serena has like a very goofy affect to her. Like when you see her being interviewed, there's a silliness to her that doesn't come across when obviously you're watching her compete and just dominate everybody. But there seems like she seems like a very fun person and kind of silly and lighthearted. So I think Venus and I probably are more similar personality wise, but I'm going to go with Serena on that one. I think that she would make me laugh, and I'm not going to even act like I would play tennis against her. Like I'm not even going to joke about that.
I mean, 2 weeks is a long time. You might find
maybe in No, I could not return her serve in 2 weeks. Who are we kidding now?
We could play some Wii tennis.
There you go. Maybe that. Yeah.
So I'm going to dive into some reader questions. And one of the first ones I saw, which I'm always super interested in too, is how long did it take you to write this thing? What was your journey like?
Yeah. So I started working on it after I finished The Mothers, but before The Mothers came out. So I was in that weird kind of lull before when the book you're like done working on it, but it isn't out in the world yet. And you're just kind of in that weird holding pattern. So I started working on it then. So that was, I don't know, about 4 or 5 years ago. It took a series of drafts to really figure this book out. I think the structure was one of the hardest parts. There's a non-chronological timeline. Right. There are all these different points of view. So it took a while for me to try to figure out exactly how I was going to tell the story and try to make it make sense. So it was an arduous journey at times, but I was very grateful that I had a great editor who helped guide me through it, because I truly was flailing at first trying to make sense of the story.
It's crazy how much you see a book is formed by other helping people, and that is great.
Yes.
Yes,
exactly.
I saw a question from Laura Knott, which said, how do you pick character names? Character names are one of my favorite things in a novel. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think character names come to me pretty easily. It's the opposite of titles. Some of them, like Desiree and Stella, I remember those two just came to me right away. They felt like the right vibe for who those characters are, their personalities.
I love that.
So those came to me pretty early on. I think Jude was one that was very difficult for me. I could not quite figure out what the name of this kid would be. So I went to a lot of, I kept circling around J names for whatever reason, but I could not really sort of decide on what name that was going to be. So Jude was a little bit more difficult. But sometimes it's just sort of
baby name websites. Do you ever do that?
I sometimes use baby name websites, but what I actually use more is the Social Security Administration website. So any writers out there, it's helpful because it tells you like the most popular names in the US by year. So you can choose, like in this book, I'm like, okay, what year would they have been born? Give me the 1,000 most popular names. I usually like scroll down somewhere in the middle, so it's not totally obscure, but it's also not super, super common.
Right.
And then from there, sometimes I'll just pick. So
right.
I find that like a weirdly helpful tool because again, like it'll help you for the time period. If you're writing, you know, if you're like, I need a name, someone born in 1980 or someone born, you know, 75, whatever, it'll give you at least a range of what was common. So I'll use that probably more than baby name websites because it lets you filter for year very easily. But yeah, so sometimes either it'll come to me right away, I'll have a feeling, or sometimes I will weirdly access the Social Security Administration website and find a name there.
No, I hear that. It's funny because I have done that. I'm not sure if it was Social Security websites, but when you're looking by year, it really reminds you of how much a name carries. And depending on where you're at, you're like, wait a second, like, why are all these Black names? Oh yeah, slavery. That's why everyone at this time has these names and everything. Yes. But it reminds you of like what's going on at those times, which is so interesting.
It does.
Yeah. Okay, I have Jennifer Erickson asking, what are you working on next?
Yeah, I'm working on my next novel, which is very, very early. I finished a draft earlier in the lockdown. So I hadn't had a time really to go back to it because of doing the virtual book tour. So now everything is winding down. I'm finally able to go back to it. So it's just it's a novel about these two singers who have a lifelong feud. So it's been fun to write. And
I love a feud so much.
I love a feud too. It's really fun to write about hate. You know, it's like it's a really different kind of vibe to write about hate. So I've enjoyed thinking about hatred as like a kind of love story.
Right. I love that a lot. I want to do Barbara Ford, who asked, who was your favorite character and why?
It's a good question. I think one of my favorite characters was Barry, who's, you know, pretty minor character. But I had a friend kind of talk to me about, so Barry is one of the friends that Jude meets in LA. And I had a friend who was like talking to me about loving Barry. And I'm like, yeah, I don't talk to people about Barry that often because he is a pretty minor character, but I do love him as this, you know, you always have that one friend who's like the center of the social group and who like kind of gathers everybody. Yes. And particularly me, like, I know like some of the lines that Barry says were things that, you know, I when I went to my MFA program, I was like straight out of undergrad. So I was one of the youngest people there. And I had some like older friends who were, you know, deeper into their 30s who like kind of took me under their wing and were like, we're going to tell you about how life is. And we're going to give you advice. So that's kind of the vibe I wanted for Barry. Yeah, it was very nice. And like, that was the vibe I wanted for Barry and Jude of him being like, okay, let me tell you, like he gives her that kind of real talk. It's kind of brotherly, but it's also, there's something I've been fortunate to be on the receiving end of those types of relationships and those types of friendships of people who are just like, I'm going to take you in and show you about life a little bit. So I did really love Barry. I also loved writing Kennedy. I know that a lot of people hate her. I don't know if there's going to be any justice for Kennedy in the comments.
Justice for Kennedy. She has a lot of attitude.
But I enjoyed writing her. You know, she's so chatty and often quite funny. And it's fun to write, I think, characters who are very different from yourself. So she's very, very different from me in a lot of ways. And there's something about that kind of motor mouth character who just never stops talking that can be really fun to write. And particularly the ways in which she's sometimes very self-aware and then sometimes lacks all self-awareness. So I enjoyed writing Kennedy. I know she does get, you know, she gets on people's nerves, I know, often, but I have a very soft spot in my heart for Kennedy.
I totally understand that, which is great. I think writers should have a soft spot for all of their characters. So I think that is great. And then the last one I'm going to do from the audience is from Michaela Englund, which is, what is your favorite place to write?
Ooh. Well, I used to love going to the coffee shop across, like around the corner from where I live. And I'm, you know, very sad that coffee shop writing seems like something into the very distant future. But I loved it because there was a feeling of it being private and also public. You know, like you put your headphones on and you see people moving around, but you're not listening really to what they're saying unless you want to kind of listen in. And there's something about that I always found really generative, just creatively, of just getting outside of your home and being out amongst people. So I do enjoy that. But I also like, I've, I also enjoy writing outside in some capacity. So maybe that's outside a coffee shop. You have some outside seating. There's something about that I realized that I also just enjoy being able to get up on the rooftop or someplace where you're just, this is clearly just me being sick of being cooped up during quarantine, where I'm just like outside in some way.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm just like out, not in my apartment on my couch.
Yep.
Just outside in some way is what I prefer. But yeah, it's been mostly couch writing for me. My couch has gone like college futon style, where it's just like covered in books and sheets of paper. So that's been what my life has been like. But I definitely am looking forward to being able to do some writing outside of that space moving forward.
I mean, can you imagine like that day you get to go back to that coffee shop and just like sit?
I know.
It's gonna be.
I know. I took so much for granted. I took it so much for granted.
I miss the annoying people that like I would see.
Yeah, exactly.
But lastly, I would love to ask you about what your book recommendations are and what you've read recently and what you're loving right now.
Yeah. So I'm reading the new Isabel Allende book right now, which is called The Long Petal of the Sea. Just trying to remember the longer title. And that's been, I love her work. So that's been a really great book. It opens with the Spanish Civil War and these characters who are in exile. So I'm at the very beginning of the book, but I'm really enjoying that right now. I think some of my favorites that I really enjoyed reading earlier during the lockdown, I really enjoyed The Glass Hotel, which I know a lot of people love. That was the book that kind of brought me back from my inability to finish reading a book when we went to lockdown. So that's like if you're in some type of a reading lull, that's a great book that will jolt you out of it because it's so propulsive and compelling, and the characters are really fascinating, and you get to I'm loving a book that takes you to multiple geographical locations. So you'll be like on a yacht, or you'll be like in New York somewhere, you'll be like in Europe or whatever. So that's a great book for that. I've also really loved the book Actress by Anne Enright. As I said, I'm working on this book about musicians and celebrity and fame. So this is a book about the daughter of this Irish theater legend. So it engages with what I'm interested in, as sort of the difference between celebrity and intimacy, and the idea that celebrities are people that we feel like we intimately know, as I was just proving when I was talking about all these famous people that I would quarantine with. So, there's the idea of like we feel like we know celebrities, but we also have no way of ever knowing these people. And in this case, it's this mother-daughter relationship that kind of exists in that weirdness and that weird tension between fame and intimacy. So that's a great book also. I really loved that one. I would recommend those for sure.
Those are great. Those are great recommendations. Anything that makes you feel like you're not on your couch right now is really great.
You won't feel like you're on Zoom. You won't feel like you're on a couch. It's great. I can recommend that. Yeah.
That's amazing. Brit, thank you so much. This was really, really fun getting to talk about this lovely book with you. Congratulations on everything. And I really hope to everyone watching, we haven't spoiled it too much. Even if we have, you should still read it. There's so much nuance going on in this story. And so if you haven't read it yet, it is available on barnesandnoble.com. Order it. Don't go out. Keep a mask on is what I'm trying to say.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I hope you have a really great night. And Novel 3 goes wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kylie. Thanks everyone for watching. Thanks, Barnes and Noble.
Thanks everyone. Bye.
nervous.